Thanks for joining the final European conference of the TRICS project. We will slowly start the conference, and the other participants will join us. It's really a great pleasure to welcome you all to present the final European findings of this project after 2 years of activities implementation and the elaboration of the final reports and new tools for practitioners. We originally planned to organize this conference in person in Brussels, but unfortunately, like for many other events, we have to change the plan and to organize it online and to also adapt the agenda. But I'm sure that we still have very interesting discussion, and we have the chance to welcome very interesting panelists to discuss about the special needs of trafficked refugees in the integration process. I would like now to give the floor to Laurent Delbos, Head of Advocacy at Forum réfugiés-Cosi, for the opening words. Laurent, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Cécile. Good morning, everybody. First of all, on behalf of Forum réfugiés-Cosi, I'd like to thank all participants to this final conference. As Cécile said, our first idea was to organize it in Brussels, but we had to change our plans at the last moment because of the health context. But I've no doubt that the quality of the content will be preserved. Today, we are going to talk about a project called TRIPS that crosses two important issues. First, human trafficking and international protection. Some elements of definition to start. Human trafficking. Human trafficking is an international criminal phenomenon. By coercion, fraud, kidnapping, abuse of power or force, victims are subjected to a form of exploitation, including sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, modern slavery or similar practices, obligation to commit crimes, or the removal of organs. Then international protection. International protection is the status granted to a person at the end of an asylum procedure when their protection needs are recognized. Now some figures to show the context. In recent years, around 300,000 protection decisions have been taken each year by the authorities of the EU member states. According to the latest study published by the European Commission, more than 26,000 victims of human trafficking were recorded in the EU member states in 2017 and 2018. 59% of registered victims were third country nationals. However, these figures represent only a partial reality of this phenomenon. What's the history of this project, of this TRIPS project? A previous European project called TRACS, coordinated by Forum réfugiés-Cosi between 2016 and 2018, provided a first opportunity to address the link between human trafficking and asylum, and aimed at better identifying and responding to the specific needs of asylum seekers who are victims of trafficking. A report and a toolkit for professionals were published at the end of the project in 2018. The next year, we propose to continue the reflection and to analyze the support provided to victims after obtaining international protection status. If the link between trafficking in human beings and the asylum procedure is increasingly studied, the issue of integrating these victims after obtaining a protection remains less discussed. This is how a new project called TRIPS was proposed to the European Commission alongside 4 European partners from Italy, Belgium, Ireland, and the Czech Republic. Right now, I'd like to thank warmly these 4 organizations for the investment in the project. Immigrant Council of Ireland, Italian Council for Refugees from Italy, Church Commission for Migrants, a European network of organizations based in Belgium, and Organization for Aid to Refugees from Czech Republic. The project analyzed the conditions of integration and the risk of being exposed to human trafficking for beneficiaries of international protection. Indeed, after obtaining the international protection status, whether or not for a trafficking situation, The European Qualification Directive of 2011 provides that member states must take into account the situation of vulnerable people in the integration process, specifically including victims of trafficking, after an individual assessment of the situation. In order to study the effective implementation of this provision, the project partners carried out a research work in close collaboration with the national authorities, with NGOs, but also with the victims themselves to better understand the legal and political system in place and the needs of victims while addressing the multiplicity of integration issues faced by trafficked refugees. The project had 4 objectives. First, inform and raise awareness about the link between human trafficking, international protection, and integration. Then, give a voice to trafficked refugees. Third, improve the capacities of all practitioners. And the last objective is to bring consistency in EU policies and practices. During this final conference, the TRIPS partners will introduce the main results of this project on 2 aspects, about 2 main issues. First, how to improve public policies in this area, and how to improve support practices for these victims. The main results observed at European level and the common recommendations made by the project partners will be presented, and these results will be then commented on by a first panel of speakers. In a second time, a toolbox aimed at better supporting refugees who are victims of trafficking will be presented at European level and with national specificities of the countries of each partners. In the second panel discussion, speakers will discuss how to improve the capacities to identify and support trafficked refugees. That's all for me. I wish you a good conference, and I let my colleague Cécile Quéval take the floor for the first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurent, for this introduction on the TRIPS project. I will continue and go a bit deeper on the activities implementation and the main findings of the project. So the TRIPS partnership led a European action research work with different activities. We created 4 national working groups gathering national authorities and civil society organizations working on integration, international protection, and human trafficking to fill in different national mapping, which sum up all the research done at national level. National discussions were organized to meet specific practitioners and experts on these different topics. We also managed to organize interviews with trafficked refugees to better understand their special needs in the integration process. And 3 European case studies were also drafted during the project. We also benefited from the support and the expertise of 4 European associated partners: the French Protection Office for Refugees and Stateless Persons, the French Immigration and Integration Office, the Secretariat of the Group of Experts on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings of the Council of Europe, and Amicale du Nid, which is a French NGO specialized in supporting victims of human trafficking. In October 2021, we published the European deliverables. So first, the European report, which includes a comparative and analytic study, and 10 common recommendations. I will briefly present you these European findings. We also published a European toolbox for practitioners, which provide common guidelines to draft your own national toolboxes for practitioners. We will also present you this European toolbox. And we are organizing today this European final conference to introduce you all these main findings and to have the opportunity to discuss it with civil society organizations, but also European institutions. So the detailed European results are available in these 2 reports, which can be downloaded from our website and from the TRIPS partners websites. I will just present briefly the main findings. I just would like also to specify that I will use the term of refugees, but it includes all international protection beneficiaries, just to facilitate the discussion. It includes refugee status and subsidiary protection beneficiaries, and they can be protected on human trafficking grounds or on other grounds. So 2 questions animated the project partners during the research. So first, how is ensures a continuum of care and support for identified victims in the asylum procedure, and how is identified a current or potential victim after getting an international protection status. So the research demonstrated that none of the 4 member states covered by the study guarantees a comprehensive and an adequate evaluation of the special needs after a victim is granted an international protection status. And more globally, an assessment report of the revised qualification directive published by the European Commission underlined that in general, member states do not reorganize a new vulnerability assessment after the asylum procedure, or they can reuse the vulnerability assessment carried out during the asylum procedure, which can be incomplete or outdated. Moreover, important challenges in sharing information regarding the specific needs of victims after the asylum procedure were highlighted during the research, including between asylum and integration authorities. Finally, no data were collected on the target group in the 4 countries covered by the study. We can see a lot of efforts to improve the data collection, but significant shortcomings were still identified, in particular to integrate asylum and international protection issues in human trafficking studies. So you can see here the main European findings regarding the integration process. So first, in accessing rights and social benefits, we can see that the issuance of residence permits or civil documentation is really a key step, especially in France and Italy. But there are many difficulties and significant delays are reported in these 2 countries, which can expose trafficked refugees to destitution and risk of exploitation. Moreover, in addition to global administrative obstacles, delays, inconsistent decision, we can see also that family reunification procedure has a significant impact, we know, on the integration process for all refugees, but additional difficulties were identified for trafficked refugees. For example, the absence of reliable contact persons in the country of origin, and the safety of the children, it's a source of fear, of worry for the trafficked refugee, which can impede also the integration process. In terms of safe and durable housing, additional obstacles have been identified to the challenges faced by all vulnerable persons in the EU, including refugees, such as the lack of places in specialized accommodation centers, long waiting times, the issue of security, which is very important for victims of trafficking, the financial capacity, and also the language barriers. Promising systems with specialized shelters or a global adapted framework were identified in France and Italy, but we also identified a lack of provision for refugees, for example, in Ireland, which expose them to discriminatory practices and the risk of destitution and exploitation. Regarding the access to care, including mental health issues, refugees are provided the same rights to access public health system as nationals, but there are no specific provision for trafficked refugees. Common challenges related to administrative procedures, a language barrier, and lack of specialized professionals and services for victims of trafficking were reported in the 4 member states. Finally, on access to employment and training, different national mechanisms are in place to support refugees to access employment and education, but there is no specific support for trafficked refugees. It's also important to mention that support provided to access labor and education is also an important opportunity to provide information on the workers' rights and prevent any exploitation situation. Moreover, the project highlighted two opposite dynamics for the trafficked refugees. First, the need of time to recover before being able to get involved in a professional project, but also the pressure to take any job to cover the costs related to the integration process. Finally, as parenting issues have a significant impact on the access to education and employment opportunities, and especially for women, but support and assistance to facilitate access to childcare services are rarely provided in the 4 member states covered by the project. You can see here the 10 common recommendations presented in the European report. Do not hesitate to consult the European report. You will see that they are much more detailed. I will just briefly present them. So first, we call for full implementation of the Article 20.3 and 0.4 of the Qualification Directive, and to set up a vulnerability assessment to identify the special needs after the protection, the international protection status is granted. Secondly, the national referral mechanism should be put in place, and it should also ensure a link with the asylum and the international protection system. Training on human trafficking should also be reinforced and include integration actors. Data collection could be improved on the trafficked refugees at European level with the support of the EU institutions and agencies. Moreover, information sharing must also be improved in order to not lose the track of unidentified victims or potential victims when they are protected, while respecting also the confidentiality rules. We also recommend to develop a clear and transparent national integration systems based on the needs of the victims, which include a trained advisor to human trafficking when it's relevant, and also with a reinforced monitoring. Access to specialized accommodation centers should also be developed and include reinforced social, legal, and medical support. A dedicated support for parenting should be also developed, especially for women refugees. And access to labor and education should also allow trafficked refugees to empower themselves and avoid any new exploitation situation. And finally, and again, following the TRACS project, which focused on the trafficked asylum seekers, we remind that the asylum procedure has a direct impact on the integration process. Early identification is crucial, and the assessment mechanisms during the asylum procedures must be strengthened and include indicators on human trafficking. All the guarantees in terms of reception procedures for trafficked asylum seekers provided in the Common European Asylum System must be fully and effectively implemented. So I will start my presentation on the main findings of the project here. You can really invite you to consult the European report and the summary reports. You can find a link on the discussion section. To finish the presentation of the main findings, we wanted to share with you the voices of the victims interviewed during the project. Direct intervention was not possible for them due to their fragility and also the fear of being exposed. So we created this video to present the project and also to introduce some of their testimonies. And you can also find their testimonies in the European reports. These testimonies were very important to identify their special needs. The toolboxes were built upon the needs identified in these interviews. It also gave them an opportunity to provide feedback on how they live in the integration systems set up in the different member states. And these testimonies are not exhaustive. It's just one example of many of the victims which should be listened and taken into account in the integration policies and in the support provided by the frontline workers. So I will now let our colleague show the video.
Victim of human trafficking requires a specific support, including when they are granted an international protection status to ensure a smooth and effective inclusion in the host society. The European project TRIPS addresses the special needs of trafficked international protection beneficiaries in their integration process. TRIPS was implemented between 2020 and 2021 and co-financed by the European Union. It is coordinated by the French NGO Forum réfugiés-Cosi and is implemented in close partnership with 4 organizations. TRIPS focuses on 4 objectives: inform and raise awareness, give a voice to victims, improve the capacities of practitioners, and bring consistency and coherency throughout EU member states. The partners interviewed several victims of human trafficking who were granted an international protection status to better understand the specific needs.
I stopped taking social benefits from them because the stress was too much. The paperwork, and also you had to come with an interpreter.
I know it will be difficult to find a job in France, but once I speak and read French, maybe it will be easier. I would like to become a lawyer or a woman police.
I didn't understand well how to have access to social benefits. I felt comfortable with the NGOs that assist me. I would never have been able to do anything without their support. I would like to have support in babysitting to let me time to find a job.
Because of the pandemic, I had to wait for a year before going to language courses. It's very hard to learn French. We are illiterate and we have never been to school. I need a good level of French to get the license, look for a job.
In the first center, I had met with a male psychologist and I could not express my feelings freely. Now I feel better because the psychologist is a woman.
I wanted to go to school because I didn't have the chance before. I work now as a care assist of children with autism. It's good when the state not only grants us a protection status, but also gives us opportunity to build a life.
The TRIPS project has published a European report which provides key recommendations to bridge the gaps, such as improve the identification of the victim, reinforce training and capacity building of practitioners, ensure access to specialized shelters, support family unity, especially for trafficked women with children, empowering victims through education and an employment base. The project partners developed a European toolbox for practitioners. 4 national toolboxes have been elaborated based on these common guidelines. You may create your own national toolbox. Find more information on the TRIPS project and its deliverables on www.forumrefugie.org.
Thank you. So I will now give the floor to Torsten Moritz to moderate the first panel on how the European law and policies can support the integration of trafficked international protection beneficiaries.
Yeah, thank you, Cécile. A very, very good morning from a sunny Brussels morning. It would have been lovely to see you all here in Brussels live, but we know what the virus is doing to us. And I'm personally happy to see you virtually today because I had an encounter with somebody who tested positive. So I need to isolate. So it's better to see you this way than not seeing you at all. It gives me great pleasure that we now have an hour together in one of the two panels today, which I have the privilege of moderating. The first panel will look at how European laws and policy can support the integration of trafficked international protection beneficiaries. And we have three of the main actors around the table. First speaker will be Lucie Laffont from the Office of the EU's Anti-trafficking Coordinator, who I don't think I have to explain what they do and why they are so important, but this is covering the EU angle into it, the EU legal framework. The second one is Samuel Boutruche, who is legal officer at for international protection policy and law at the UNHCR. And it goes without saying why the UNHCR, as the guardian of the Refugee Convention, has enormous importance for an issue covering international protection. And third speaker is our colleague Sofia Bonatti, who is a senior legal officer at the European Council of Refugees and Exiles, the most comprehensive European network of organizations working to assist and value refugees and exiles and work with them. We have foreseen that we have three very, relatively short initial inputs of 10 minutes, maybe a question and answer after that with some questions of understanding, and then hopefully a vivid exchange, we will be going on until 11:20. And I've already noted that all three speakers are in principle in the panel here. I've seen their identity. So without much further ado, I would like to invite Lucie Laffont to come in and give us her assessment, what the European Commission can do to tackle trafficking in human beings, liaise with the asylum and international protection process, and how European policies can help to address the integration challenges of trafficked refugees. What could be reinforced, what works. And I'm getting here from Brussels Press Club the question, if you could possibly turn off your cameras when you're not part of the discussion. So if you could do that, if all three panelists have their camera on and everybody else has them off, and Lucie would start now, that would make me a very happy person.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the very interesting presentation on the TRIPS project. As you know, victims are identifying mixed migration flows with women and children being at particular risk of being trafficked. Criminal networks abuse the vulnerabilities of high-risk groups as well as asylum procedures, mainly for the purpose of sexual exploitation. So these are findings from European Commission recent reports. The identification and detection of victims or potential victims of trafficking in these flows remains a challenge which has to be addressed. And on this basis, the European Commission presented in April 2021 the EU strategy on combating trafficking in human beings, which set up actions for the year 2021-2025. The strategy addresses trafficking in human beings with a comprehensive response, from the prevention of the crime through the protection of the victims to the prosecution and conviction of traffickers. And it takes into account in particular women and children as the most vulnerable to the crime. Legislation is one of the most powerful tools that we have at our disposal to fight the crime. It allows to define the crime, to set the sanction and common objectives, to prosecute criminals and to protect the victims. And this is why our first priority and our main priority at the moment is to make sure that the EU legislation is still fit for purpose 10 years after its adoption. This is why the Commission launched a study for the evaluation of the Anti-trafficking Directive. And based on the outcome of the study, the Commission will consider reviewing the directive. As part of this evaluation, the Commission will also carry out an assessment on the possibility to have minimum EU rules that criminalize the use of explicit services of victims of trafficking. We will launch also in the coming days a public consultation in the context of the evaluation of the directive, and we hope we can count on your contribution. The strategy further focuses on 4 areas of action, which are all equally important. The first one is to reduce the demand that fosters trafficking for all forms of exploitation. The second one is to break the business model of traffickers, and this includes in the online environment and offline environment. The third one is to protect, support, and empower the victims with specific focus on women and children. And finally, the strategy also has a strong focus on the international dimension of the crime. We all know that victims of trafficking are faced with specific difficulties, including in the context of international protection procedures, in being identified at an early stage, actually at the pre-screening stage, in accessing their rights at a later stage, or in having their specific needs taken into account when they receive assistance and support, including during the asylum procedure. Under the new Pact on Migration and Asylum and the legislative proposal that the Commission presented in September 2020, being an applicant for international protection and a victim or a potential victim of trafficking implies special procedural guarantees from the early stage and special reception conditions. In this context, the anti-trafficking strategy seeks to improve the early identification of victims and their referral for further assistance and protection through the capacity building and sharing of best practices between all practitioners that are likely to come into contact with victims, in particular among vulnerable groups. The strategy also forces to facilitate victim empowerment and reintegration programs such as health, psychological, or legal specialized services, and also to facilitate access to education and economic opportunities for victims of trafficking. So this implies that we have necessary mechanisms in place for the early identification, assistance, and support for victims. And it also implies that we have necessary structures in place, for example, appropriate accommodation, notably for child victims. The Commission will also support gender-specific and child rights-based training to help police, immigration, asylum officers, border guards, social workers, healthcare staff to detect and protect the victims. And it will also enable targeted funding to support specialized shelters for victims of trafficking, including specialized facilities for trafficked women and children that allow them to escape from traffickers and that are adapted to their specific needs and circumstances. The EU member states have taken measures to establish appropriate mechanisms that aim at the early identification, assistance, and support of victims, which are core referral mechanisms and that you mentioned in your presentation earlier. The Commission carried out in 2020 a study on national and transnational mechanisms in the member states. And the study identified several areas for further improvement, such as in detecting potential victims, making available appropriate accommodation, notably for child victims, strengthening cooperation among all actors, including with the civil society, involvement of civil society organizations. The study further provides information on how victims of trafficking are detected and identified in asylum and international protection system in the member states. So in this context, the Commission will enhance actions to improve victim support and referral in the cross-border context toward the objective of setting up a European referral cooperation mechanism. And the strategy on combating trafficking human beings also invites member states to improve the functioning of the national referral mechanism. Stepping up cooperation with non-EU countries of origin and transit of the victim, as well as with international and regional partners, including international organizations, is key in achieving all these actions. And finally, I will just say a few words about funding, ensuring appropriate funding to combat trafficking in human beings, and to support the priorities and the key action of the EU strategy on combating trafficking in human beings is essential. And the Commission will launch in February 2022 a new call for proposal on the assistance, support, and integration of third country national victims of trafficking under the Asylum, Migration, and Integration Fund. And the call will support concrete transnational measures that aim at enhancing the integration of the victims in the host country, taking into account their specific needs and circumstances, as well as victims among vulnerable groups. So I thank you for your attention, and I remain available for further questions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Lucie. The way I suggest we proceed is that we briefly see if there's any immediate question of people not having understood or wanting more information, and then we go to the next speakers before coming to more thematic discussions. And please make yourself, we're quite a bunch of people, make yourself known in the chat to me so that I can call you. And while I'm waiting for that, I have one question. If Lucie, you could say a few more things about the study on the EU Anti-Trafficking Directive, the most important instrument and indeed 10 years old. What will it look at? Implementation again, future perspectives, shortcomings? If you could say 3 more words about it.
Yes, of course. So we launched a study that will evaluate the implementation of the anti-trafficking directive, and we'll look at the gaps in the implementation, and then we will also have an impact assessment that will look at whether we'll have a forward-looking perspective, and we'll look at what we can do to improve the implementation of the directive, or what we can do to improve the legal framework on trafficking human beings at the EU level. This study will come up with potential proposal for revision of the anti-trafficking directive. So for now, we launched the evaluation, and of course we will involve as many stakeholders as we can in the process, because it's very important to have the views of everyone that is involved in anti-trafficking actions, including civil society organizations. And this is why we really invite you to contribute to the public consultation that will be launched in the next few days or maybe next week. That will be published on the Commission website. We will share with our networks and also on social media. So we invite you to follow this and really to contribute. It's very valuable for us.
Thanks a million, and I'm saying that without having consulted Cécile, but I'm quite sure we can share the information about the consultation once it's launched. At the moment, I don't see anybody wanting to come in, so everything you said was crystal clear. And then that gives me the pleasure to introduce Samuel Boutruche to you, who is with the Department of International Protection and UNHCR. And not totally surprisingly, the main question we asked to him was about UNHCR guidelines, the support of UNHCR to the integration of trafficked refugees, and recommendations in the field. And I know that Samuel has a presentation which is already up in the screen. Samuel, very much welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Torsten. Very nice to see you again, at least virtually. And thanks a lot to all the organizers for having us. That's a pleasure being a part of this final conference. The findings of the report we've been actually studying with great interest, and we'll take them into account. In 10 minutes, I won't be able to, of course, give you an overview of UNHCR activities on this topic. But maybe I can share with you more details later on. I chose to focus on a few introductory remarks, which actually have an impact on the integration of trafficked refugees. Then specific considerations on this challenge, as well as to conclude maybe a point which was not so much alluded to so far, which is to look at trafficking as somehow a mitigating circumstance when actually states are imposing obligations on trafficked refugees, and actually to what extent this should also be taken into account to lift some of the requirements given the trafficking experience. Maybe you can move to the next slide. Thanks a lot. Just to remind everybody, although this is of course known to many of you, trafficking of course may be a ground as such for international protection, whether indeed refugee status or subsidiary protection. I hyperlink here our guidelines on the matter, as well as an interesting statement that we made in France in the context of two cases of trafficked victims looked at by the Cour nationale du droit d'asile, which shows also UNHCR involvement in this respect through judicial engagement. Of course, actually, integration will be all the more challenging when trafficking is either a ground for the status, or actually comes in as an additional victim or trauma in addition to, of course, an existing ground. A second consideration here, just to also inform the discussions later, is the particular vulnerability of beneficiaries of international protection to trafficking. In this regard, we are actually undertaking a study on trafficking in refugee settings, not only refugee camps, but also actually urban areas. So this will be conducted early next year. and I think will bring a specific perspective on indeed the particular vulnerability of this group. A third aspect is, and this was of course mentioned, especially with respect to the need to ensure better cooperation with the different services and authorities. Just to remind you of the fact that we need to distinguish and assess also the interaction between the refugee status and the status of victim of trafficking. I mentioned here our comments, but maybe you would be interested to also look at the Council of Europe Convention against trafficking, which has actually 2 saving clauses, including one regarding residence permit. It's very important here to actually prioritize, of course, the assessment through the asylum procedure and possibly the granting of protection, which will entail a longer term residence permit compared to the one offered to victims, for example, cooperating with the authorities. A fourth, of course, aspect is the impact of COVID-19, which actually made the situation even worse regarding the incidence of trafficking in this vulnerable group. I also included here 2 interesting reports for your consideration. Now, moving quickly to some specific integration needs of trafficked refugees. Next slide, please. As Lucie mentioned, of course, the need to identify victims as early as possible. I mean, this is, of course, of paramount importance because they are actually entitled to specific guarantees all the way through the asylum procedures in terms of reception conditions, of course, the adjudication of their case and the integration process. Now, 2 considerations also regarding the integration services. Of course, they are entitled to specific protection as victims of trafficking, also in terms of psychological support. This was mentioned by some of the victims in the video. I think this is really important, including, of course, ensuring that these services are provided by properly trained officials with a gender-specific perspective. But also just to, of course, remind also the fact that accessing the other general services for the victims will, of course, depend on whether or not their trafficking experience is taken into account. And that's, I think, very important to remember. So they are not only entitled to specific types of integration services, but actually this entitlement is critical to ensure effective access to the other services. And here was interesting also to mention that actually successful integration is in itself a protection from re-trafficking, which I think is also very important to broaden the perspective in terms of protection. And to conclude, just a few words regarding an aspect indeed which is sometimes a bit neglected, is regarding actually the extent to which the trafficking experience should be taken into account when imposing obligations on the victims. I mean, this goes, of course, beyond the specific situation of international protection beneficiaries, but I think it's particularly important. And in this regard, actually, in the proposal for the qualification regulation, there was actually a plan to make the access to certain social assistance conditional on the effective participation in integration measures. And this is actually for victims of trafficking a challenge in itself. So they may well have actually very valid reasons in relation to their trafficking experience and trauma not to be able to participate fully and effectively in integration measures, which actually in turn, of course, should be made for them in particular readily and effectively accessible. This, I think, came out very strongly in the testimonies we listened to in the video. So to conclude, just to draw your attention also back to some rulings, is a Luxembourg court ruling which actually concerned family reunification cases, but precisely the imposition of a civic evaluation test on the family reunification applicants, which did not sufficiently take into account their mental state and situation according to the CGEU. And that's where specifically the CGEU actually required member states to take into account the individual hardship when imposing obligations on these individuals. So I thought a parallel with this judgment was interesting also to feed into our discussions on imposing obligations on victims of trafficking who are facing very often same challenges. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Samuel, for this comprehensive presentation. Once again, my invitation to everybody to let me know in the chat if you have immediate questions. I have one immediate question, and I think on behalf of the participants, question always comes, can you share the presentation? I presume we can?
Yeah, no, well, that's the reason why I bothered including so many resources in it. So I was hoping I could count on you to disseminate it.
And disseminate we will. Any other questions? At the moment, our audience is still a bit hesitant, but I'm sure that they're saving their energy for an even more interactive discussion after the third input, which is coming from Sofia. We had been hoping with the organizers and the participants of the project that in 2 days' time, we would at the ECRE general meeting be able to be part of a workshop presenting the results, and that has now fallen. Still, it is very good to have you here because it's been increasingly becoming clear that in the NGO world, it's not only the anti-trafficking organizations which have an important interest in the issue of trafficking and integration of trafficked persons, but that also there is the refugees and exiles angle, and there's no other organization to represent that better than ECRE. So I'm therefore very, very happy to hear from you reflection on the NGO role in supporting trafficked persons, but also more general considerations as well. You have a presentation and the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thank you very much for the kind introduction, Torsten. And we are also very sorry that we cannot go ahead with the meeting with the tomorrow, but considering the situation, we're very happy to be here today to discuss about this very important project. So in my presentation, I just want to mention that I would like to have a quick overview on why there's a need to talk about trafficking in an asylum context, as someone already mentioned a little bit, and then have a look at the legal standards regarding the role of NGOs in the protection of victims of trafficking. So as many of you probably already know, civil society organizations often deal with asylum cases where individuals are at once in need of international protection and victims of trafficking or at risk of becoming victims due to the precarious conditions faced in the asylum procedure. And that's why we think that it's important to have first a look at the link between trafficking and asylum. So if you want to pass to the next slide. As you know, victims of trafficking cannot be seen outside the context of asylum and migration. There are numerous reasons to make the connection with asylum necessary. So first of all, we have to think about the situation of flight and dangerous journeys that make an individual more vulnerable to trafficking. And don't forget that trafficking, smuggling, and asylum-seeking journeys can very often overlap. Then we need to also consider the psychological state of people in flight and the physical risk and the overall sense of despair that can create conditions that actually facilitate trafficking. And finally, fleeing from countries which offer no protection against trafficking, against trafficked victims, and actually where trafficking is a ground of persecution. So I just wanted to give this quick overview to understand why we're talking about trafficking and asylum at the same time. And now I just wanted to give you an overview of the legal standards regarding the role of NGOs in the protection of victims of trafficking. So if we look at the next slide, the importance of the role of NGOs lies in the unique position that these stakeholders are found in. So on one side, NGOs can facilitate and ensure the provision of specialized services to victims, and they can also provide important information to authorities. This has been recognized in law by the Council of Europe and the EU, and also several international mechanisms have addressed the need of coordinated support in combating trafficking. So to have just a quick overview, we can start with the Council of Europe. As we mentioned, there's the Convention Against Trafficking in Human Beings, where state parties commit themselves to taking individual and collective actions to criminalize trafficking, as well as a range of minimum steps necessary to respect and protect the rights of trafficked persons. In this convention, the role of NGOs has been emphasized in numerous articles. Just to have a quick view, Article 5 on the measures to prevent trafficking, Article 10 on the identification of victims with the support of civil society organizations. Again, Article 12 mentions the assistance to victims of trafficking provided by civil society organizations. And Article 35 is actually titled Cooperation with Civil Society. And it says that each party shall encourage state authorities and public officials to cooperate with NGOs and members of civil society in establishing strategic partnership with the aim of achieving the purpose of the convention. Since we are mentioning the convention, we also need to talk about the Greta group of experts, which is the convention's monitoring body. So if you look at the next slide, according to Article 38 of the convention, the Greta group may request information from civil society on a variety of trafficking issues. For example, in its report, the group has stressed the importance of the role of NGOs on awareness raising, on research trainings, detecting victims of trafficking, providing them with accommodation and other types of assistance, and supporting them through the criminal justice process, and in case victims want to claim compensation. So the input of civil society in evaluating the implementation of the convention, it has been considered crucial also by this the Greta group. In its 8th thematic report on assistance to victims, Greta has also highlighted the following points on the role of civil society in protection against trafficking. And I wanted to mention them because I think they're quite important. Greta mentions the importance of a lawyer being appointed as soon as there are reasonable grounds for believing that a person is a victim of trafficking. It also highlights the psychological assistance provided by NGOs and the need for support towards NGOs working in the field, and in general, the importance of securing funds to ensure efficient functioning of civil society. Therefore, since civil society has such a prominent role in the support of victims of trafficking and combating trafficking, it's highlighted that it's important to make sure that it's functioning efficiently, providing funds. Then I wanted to mention regarding EU law. On the next slide, you will see the EU Anti-trafficking Directive, which is Directive 36/2011, which sets standards and obligations in the fight against trafficking. Here, again, there are some provisions which mention the importance of the role of NGOs. You can see recital 6, it says, and then, well, I'm also mentioning the Charter, Article 1 and 5, of course, are quite important, but in the next slide, you can see more in detail the provisions of the Trafficking Directive. Recital 6 says that member states should encourage and work closely with civil society organizations. Article 11 on assistance and support in cooperation with relevant organizations. Article 18 on prevention. And Article 19, where it says that, again, member states should shall take the necessary measures in close cooperation with relevant civil society organizations active in this field. I really wanted to mention quite quickly the ECHR, the European Court on Human Rights, on the next slide, because we believe that it's important to remind that Article 4 ECHR prohibits slavery and forced labor, so Article 4 of the Convention. The court has interpreted this article to also encompass trafficking, and it also imposes positive obligations upon states. This is quite important. For trafficking related case law, you can see the most recent compilation on the link of the PowerPoint, which can be shared afterwards. In the next slide, I wanted to flag the Randstad versus Cyprus case, as the court noted the obligations for effective procedures for a rapid identification. Again, so this rapid identification comes out all the time, which shows the importance of this first step on combating trafficking. And the court has said that has recognized that trafficking falls within the scope of Article 4 ECHR. I also wanted to flag in the next slide another important case, quite recent, the VCL and AN versus the UK, because the court went really far in recognizing positive obligations for states, and you can see why there is a need for collaboration. If you can, I really encourage to read the cases. It's really interesting. And the court highlights the importance of a collaboration between law enforcement authorities and specialized civil society stakeholders on this issue. The case is quite recent. It's from February 2021, and it concerned two Vietnamese men who were still minors when they were found working on a cannabis factory in the UK. In this case, the court actually said that Article 4 requires that victims of trafficking are promptly identified, regardless of whether the victims were able to identify and mention their experience. So this is really important. And the court also said that potential victims of trafficking can only be prosecuted following an assessment on whether they have been trafficked, and that prosecutorial services should be aware of protocols around trafficking cases. So again, it's quite an important decision. As a final slide, I would like to mention quickly CEDAW, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. The next slide. CEDAW has recently published its most comprehensive recommendation on trafficking of women in the context of global migration, which is General Comment Recommendation number 38. Among other points, the committee mentions the role of NGOs in protecting women against trafficking in different ways. So it's the importance of providing early identification, again, with the collaboration of civil society, the importance of the partnership between authorities and civil society to implement strategies that prevent trafficking, and again, providing adequate funding to for a national referral mechanism which will work in coordination with the with civil society organizations. Just to conclude, as has been highlighted by the main findings of this TRIPS project, you have seen that in practice, vulnerability assessments are not carried out in any systematic manner. There is a lack of specific mechanism for early identification of asylum seekers with special needs, and a lack of training on trafficking indicators. And this is something that we see every day, that despite the safeguards in the EU asylum acquis, the ones that we just saw, and international law, like it's very difficult to identify and address the special needs of asylum seekers because the implementation is very inconsistent. So in conclusion, I wanted to say that the role of civil society organization can be really crucial for the identification of vulnerabilities and special needs, and the need to refer the case to national authorities in charge of reception conditions and the asylum procedure. So in the next slide, you can see my preliminary conclusions. So the need for continuing advocacy work in this on this topic, and also to continuing raising awareness through projects like this one, and trainings even within civil societies themselves, within lawyers and judges. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sofia. Thanks also for already saying that we can share the PowerPoint. And thanks for reminding us that the work doesn't stop when the project ends. For us, as at the end of a project, that's particularly important and a good reminder. We have one question here, and that was about the continued support, particularly after protection is granted. We have quite a lot of things in the asylum logic, the international protection logic, what needs to be provided until status is granted, reception conditions, and it becomes traditionally a bit evasive what happens afterwards. The anti-trafficking logic has looked a bit more at it, but could I have some thoughts from you? There was the suggestion, could we maybe once again have a vulnerability assessment after the asylum procedure, that somebody may be recognized legally, but in many, many other aspects, very vulnerable. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe we start in the same logic with Lucie first, then Samuel, and then Sofia. Would that be okay? Yeah, then Lucie, please let us know your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Well, I think what's really important is really to involve all the actors that will be involved in the integration process of the victims of trafficking. After they have been identified and after they have received assistance and support. This is why we also think that the role of national reform mechanism can be really important, because it can connect all the different stakeholders, and it can ensure that, once victims have been identified, they actually receive protection and support, and they can actually be referred to services that will help them to reintegrate into society, to have access to education, have access to the labor market as well. So yeah, the role of national reform mechanism is really important. It's also very important to make sure that the victims who are in asylum procedure are identified as victims of trafficking in human beings, because this will also give them the rights to have specific rights and specific protection as a victim of trafficking in human beings, that then will continue also after the asylum status has been granted. So this is why the identification of victims in the asylum process is really important, and we know that it's often a challenge, and there's often maybe a lack of communication between the asylum and immigration actors and the anti-trafficking actors, and often victims will receive asylum protection without being identified as victim of trafficking. So yeah, I think this is something really important.
Thanks, Lucie. I think I will come later back to that institutional cooperation, but first let's give the word to Samuel.
Thanks. No, this is actually a very valid question, because the granting of a protection is actually somehow a new beginning, and as actually the colleagues mentioned, the integration process is starting from this time, at least in terms of specific entitlements. Maybe just to flag here that, well, the cooperation between the authorities is key. This was mentioned already. Another aspect is the fact that this support is actually critical because from the granting of the status, I mean, there are many other aspects which should be taken care of and which will contribute to the integration, thinking primarily about, for example, family reunification, where, of course, the entitlement starts with the granting of the status and specific requirements for refugee to be actually lifted. We have to, of course, consider the trafficking experience here. If it's already difficult for a refugee to actually provide documentary evidence or proof of family link, imagine for victims of trafficking. So I think, yeah, this is critical for the success to the integration process. And as I mentioned, I mean, integration per se is a way to protect against street trafficking, but we should also consider that failure to integrate might actually push some refugees into trafficking for the first time after the recognition of the status, which of course would be very, very unfortunate. Thank you.
Sofia.
Yes, I just wanted to say something similar to what Samuel just said, the importance of the integration process, of course, and mostly highlight the importance of these, the fact that a person failing to integrate can fall again on trafficking. Integration means having support on accessing labor, but also having an adequate housing. We had experiences where persons were actually, so like traffickers knew where these persons were staying and they were just waiting for them outside. So it's really important to help people to be empowered and also seek assistance in case anything like this happens, but mostly supporting them with the integration process and accessing labor. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I would just here like to flag we're in the TRIPS project, which simply speaking looked at everything after recognition. But once again, here it would also be interesting to look at tracks where it was a lot about identification, but also the asylum procedure, the particular vulnerability created, for example, by destitution in the asylum procedure, but also cases in the Dublin procedure, which were not clear. So it's not the main subject here, but just to flag there's something to look at as well there. There was a question about what could be done to improve the collaboration between authorities and NGOs, as it's very clear these two actors need to interact. Maybe we do it the other way around, that Sofia first comes, because I see her nodding, and then Samuel, and then Lucie.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. So as you saw from the presentation, there are a lot of provisions that encourage collaboration between authorities and civil society. I think there's a lot to be done yet. So one main issue is the lack of fundings. But in general, I think this lack of fundings encompasses everything related to trafficking yet, because we need there's a need of training also to the authorities. There's this lack of early identification is mostly due to the lack of training by the authorities. So I think that what can be done to improve the collaboration is really pushing through to a better communication between the civil society organization and the authorities, and really having additional trainings for everyone. We believe that this can really help to identify cases earlier.
Thanks. Samuel, your thoughts?
Thanks a lot. Now I'm thinking about the projects we did actually in the context of alternatives to detention. And one of the main outcome of these pilot projects was precisely the breakthrough in the like mutual understanding and cooperation between the civil society and the authorities. And I suspect actually this could be a very concrete way to improve the dialogue. Actually, having projects which actually involve the two sides. Just another point is the fact that if we focus on refugees, once recognized, it's actually even more challenging because there are many more authorities actually involved in the integration process, as opposed to, of course, during the asylum procedure when it's mostly immigration/asylum authorities. So I think, precisely. If we were to design some projects to bring these interlocutors closer, we would need to have a very broad approach. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, Lucie has very much insisted on the importance of national referral mechanisms. But I think if we're honest, we haven't always been able to think national referral mechanisms, including the asylum authorities. So I think there's some space. But Lucie, I don't want to take your space away because I'm sure you have lots of reflection on the cooperation.
I think that the other panelists have already mentioned a few very relevant points, notably the EU legal framework that encourages cooperation with civil society organizations. It's really important that civil society organizations also participate to training that are organized for law enforcement authority, judicial authorities. So I think it's important to push for a multi-stakeholder and multidisciplinary approach also to capacity building and to training. Also at the Commission, we have two networks, the EU Civil Society Platform Against Trafficking Human Beings and the EU Network of National Rapporteur and Equivalent Mechanism. And we also try to encourage the cooperation and the dialogue between these two networks by organizing meetings that once a year that gather the two networks, so they can also share best practices and also meet each other and then develop further cooperation.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I think we're almost ready to go into the next session where we will be looking at the European and the national toolbox and the process around it, which in many ways was related to roundtables, getting different actors on board and creating communication. But I'd like to give a last chance for questions. And if I don't see anyone, a last half-minute space for each one of the three speakers to share the last thing you wanted us to know before we go into the next session. Any more questions? I don't think this is the case, so let's start once again in the logic we initially had, half a minute. What would you still like us to know on your reflections? Lucie?
Perhaps just that the civil society organization, but also national authorities will be key actors in the implementation of the action of the EU strategy on combating trafficking in human beings. So I hope we will have, and I'm sure we will have other occasion also to discuss more concretely what we can do to improve the situation and protection of victims. In particular, there are specific actions such as the European Referral Cooperation Mechanism, where we think that the civil society organization will be very important actors to also see what is already being done and how we can work together to develop something that really link together the different member states and new countries in order to make sure that victims have access to their rights and to protection.
Thanks, and I think I speak for everybody that we're looking forward to that. Samuel, your thoughts?
No, well, just to thank all of you. That was very thought-provoking. We will actually keep all of you posted on the different research activities that we undertook. As I mentioned, there is one on trafficking in refugee settings. We are also actually undertaking one regarding the trafficking phenomenon in reception centers. So it will be very important to of course, keep each other informed, and greater cooperation as exemplified with this event today is I think to be continued. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And last word to Sofia.
Yes, thank you very much again for the invitation to speak at this very important project. And then just a thought that we've seen that we have a lot of actual pieces of legislation or mechanisms in place and as this project highlights. So I think it's very important to make sure that we know them, we know how to use them, and we make sure that we try to disseminate these mechanisms. Thank you.
That gives me the opportunity to thank all three of you again. And let me see if I find the clapping symbol on my program. I don't, so let me just clap like this. And I see others are as well. Thank you very, very much for these insightful thoughts of yours and presentation of lots of work in progress. It's good to know that this is not the end, but the beginning of something. I would just like to say that we will be coming back to certain points later in the program, particularly how this pans out nationally and institutionally. Now in the presentation of the European and national toolboxes for the next half hour. And you'll see me again at 11:50 moderating the session on improving the capacity to identify and support trafficked persons in the integration and recovery process. I now hand over to Cécile, but not without noting that we must be in a particularly blessed situation. There was no communication breakdown. Nobody dropped out of the communication. No, you haven't unmuted yourself. So in that sense, I think there's a good omen for our future cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Torsten. Thank you to all the panelists. It was very interesting to have your inputs and your reflection on the findings of the TRIPS project. We will continue now our conference from a field perspective by presenting the toolboxes for practitioners elaborated as part of the TRIPS project. As mentioned in the opening words, one of the objectives of the project was to improve the capacities of frontline workers, including national authorities and workers from NGOs. It was mentioned in the first panel how it's important to improve the training and the capacity building of all actors involved in this process to identify victims of human trafficking after being granted an international protection status, to better understand and identify also their special needs regarding the integration process, and how also to refer them to an adequate service. So to do so, and thanks to all the research that was done during the first year of the project, the TRIPS partnership drafted a European toolbox for practitioners. So this European toolkit, it provides a common framework, advice, guidelines to develop national toolboxes and adapt it to the national context. So there are three main parts in this toolbox. The first one is dedicated to the human trafficking, so basic knowledge on what is human trafficking and its link with international protection and the integration process. Secondly, we have a specific part on the identification of the victims and how to also identify their special needs and to respond to them. And finally, and this is where the national toolboxes are much more rich than the European toolbox, is how to provide support and to refer the victims to an adequate service. So the European toolbox, it's a PDF document. You can find it on our website. You will find a link in the discussion box in a minute. It's not an online tool, but we try to create a very interactive tool where you can find many links to external resources, but also to go through the document and to find the relevant information quite easily and quickly. At the same time, we try to work on an ingenious design where you can print a diagram or matrix, for example, on one page and put it on your desk, and you have every time you need this kind of information is really easy to use. So I will show you some examples of concrete tools that you can find in these documents. So to adapt again this European toolbox to your national context. So for example, you will find all along the document advice in each section on how to adapt the tool to your national context. It can be on the legal framework, on the actors involved, on specific case law at national level, list of services provided, existing tools at national level. So we really also guide the user to adapt this European toolbox to your national context. at the beginning also of the European Toolbox, you can see a checklist where the user can assess its needs and its knowledge in human trafficking, international protection, and integration, and find easily and fast the appropriate information he needs, and go directly to the appropriate section. You can see here an example of a diagram which presents the definition of the human trafficking. The same, you can print this kind of information, put it in your office. It's also an easy tool for the social worker and national authorities when they are doing an assessment and vulnerability assessment of refugees. Here you can see, for example, a focus box on an important topic. So you can find this kind of focus boxes all along the document. The design was created to make it really easy to read, to use for the frontline workers, and to avoid long part of text, but where you can struggle to find the appropriate information. Here, another example of tool in the toolbox, a summary checklist where it sum up all the important information to lead, for example, an interview with trafficked refugees. And here, a list of suggested questions to identify the special needs of trafficked refugees in the integration process. The same, all this tool that I present here, you can adapt it to your national context. It's really common guidelines to help you to have the most appropriate tool to your national context. So 4 national toolboxes have been already drafted by the project partners. So in Czech Republic, in France, in Ireland, and in Italy. And now we are inviting other EU member states, national authorities, but also civil society organizations to adapt this European toolkits to your national context, and to provide finally a new tool for practitioners. They can use it to have a more adapted and adequate support to trafficked refugees in their integration process. I will now let the floor to the 4 national project officers of the TRIPS project to present their national perspective on this new tool, how they adapted the European Toolbox to the national context, and also the first results of the dissemination at national level, because they all organize training sessions at national level to disseminate and to train practitioners to this new toolkit and to the support provided to trafficked refugees. So we will start with the Czech Republic. We'll make a small travel in Europe. And so we'll start with Petra on Czech Republic. Petra, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the word, Cécile. Good morning, everybody. We decided to keep the 3 main parts of the toolbox and adjusted the content to emphasize that the toolbox is mainly a practical tool for practitioners. So we kept the main chapters, but we moved glossary to the first annex and the international and European legal framework part to the second annex, so that the main body of the toolbox is focused on the practical information. And then we created the third annex, which are the indicators of human trafficking. It's a list of the questions which could practitioners ask the presumed victims of the trafficking. So if they are talking with a client and they have a suspicion that this person could be a trafficked person, they might use this list of the question to find out and to confirm if this person really could be a victim of trafficking. And then we moved the list of questions for identification of special needs from the chapter 2, so that this could be printed separately and the practitioners could use it even when they are talking with the person directly. In all the chapters, we also added the information relevant for the Czech Republic. And it was really helpful for us to discuss the content and the structure of the toolbox during one of the focus groups, where there are the representatives of UNHCR organization La Strada, the representative of refugee facilities administration, the representative of coordination group for combating trafficking in human beings, and other NGOs. Can I ask for the next slide, please? And based on the toolbox, we created 3 trainings with cooperation with organization La Strada. 2 were in person and 1 was online. We originally planned to do all of them in person, but due to COVID situation, we were forced to do the last one online. Altogether, we had 27 participants from several NGOs and also from the Integration Asylum Center, which is quite a lot of people, considering that in Czech Republic there are not that many institutions and organizations who are focused on this topic. The participants were social workers, intercultural workers, lawyers, and also program coordinators. The structure of the training, at the beginning we had the brief introduction of the project, and then followed the theoretical part. We focused to explain the participants what is human trafficking, types of human trafficking, what is the relation to migration and integration of the international protection beneficiaries. We provided some statistical information about human trafficking in the EU and also in Czech Republic. We introduced the rights and guarantees for the victims, and also we focused on the identification of the victims. And then followed the first role play. We created 2 model cases. They were not the real cases, but there were some features from the cases we already met during our work. One of them was the case of a woman from Nigeria who was sexually exploited, and another one was the man from Ukraine who was the victim of forced labor. And we divided participants into the groups of 3 or 4 people, and the role play was 30 minutes, and then a discussion of 30 minutes followed. The first role play was focused how to recognize that the clients, the practitioners are talking to, might be the trafficked person. And one of the participants was playing the client, one of the participants was a social worker, and another participant or 2, they were watching the interaction, and then they could say what they think about that, what would be their advices. Then after this role play and after the discussion, another theoretical part followed, which was based on the chapter 2 of the toolbox, and we introduced practitioners how to carry on a sensitive interview with the client about whom we already know that is a victim of trafficking, in order to identify her or his specific needs and also to secure the specific needs. We also introduced the chapter 3, where are the contacts on the organizations and institutions who are dealing with the help and securing the needs of the migrants and also the victims of trafficking. And then another 2 role plays followed. The second one was how to carry the interview with the trafficked client and how to secure his or her needs. So the participants already knew that the client who they are talking to is the victim of trafficking, and they were trying to find out what are the fields of their need, what do they need, and how could they help them. And after the discussion, the third role play followed, and it was focused on the identification of a re-trafficked client and discussion. So it meant that we created a situation that the client was trafficked again in the Czech Republic. After some time, they already lived here, because also after getting asylum, they are still in a vulnerable situation and in a danger of re-trafficking. altogether, we had really positive feedback from the practitioners. They said that it's kind of unique because there were no before the trainings which would combine how to work with people who are migrants and also the victims of trafficking. So I hope we would find a way how to ensure the continuum of these trainings, because we find out that the people are really interested to participate in it, and I found it really useful. Thank you.
And thank you, Petra. It's indeed very interesting to have to hear. It's very positive feedback. I give now the floor to Caroline to give a presentation on France.
Yes, thank you, Cécile. I hope you can all hear me well. Okay. Well, I'm Caroline Goerlich. I'm a European project officer at Forum réfugiés-Cosi, and I was in charge of the implementation of TRIPS activities in France. So I conducted the research, the interview with practitioners and with victims of trafficking, also the focus group, and I drafted the reports and the toolbox. So I will present you the results of the French activities, and but well, I warmly invite all French speaker people to look at the national report and the national toolbox if they want more information, and also if they want to reach out to me if you have some question. So as it was already presented, France share some with the other country studied within the TRIPS project some common shortcomings. For example, the fact that there is no vulnerability assessment after obtaining international protection, that it rely on the identification at the beginning of the asylum procedure. Also, some challenges in the identification and sharing information on international beneficiaries. International protection beneficiaries' special needs. Also, the fact that there is no data collected on this target group and the need for more trainings for practitioners. However, there are also some particularities in the French legal framework. So in particular, the fact that there is no national referral mechanism for the detection, identification, and referral and support of presumed or confirmed victims of trafficking. Well, however, it's in the second National Action Plan against trafficking, French authorities committed to create a national referral mechanism soon. Also, there is very few public policies and specialized facilities really dedicated to the target group, so trafficked international protection beneficiaries. There are some policies dedicated to the target group, for example, and the authorities are more and more taking this into account. For example, with the new and promising mechanism of accommodation dedicated to trafficked women beneficiaries of international protection, which provide reinforced and adapted support. And finally, the fact that integration actors have few links with trafficking in human beings actors, which really reduce their ability to identify victims and to refer them to specialized services. So, and as it was already presented, victims have special needs that need to be taken care of, notably early identification, adapted support, security, empowerment, avoiding re-trafficking, and adapted healthcare services and parenting support. So that's why in France, the results of the research and interview with practitioners was that practitioners expressed a very strong need for identification and referral tools. And so in order to help practitioners to meet this need, in the toolbox, we insisted on those two aspects, identification and referral. So in the three parts of the toolbox already mentioned previously, so we included, for the part on human trafficking and international protection, we included legal definition, figures, videos of testimony, trainings, a list of indicators, and also a lot of links to other useful tools, for example, self-identification tools, video comic strip are also self-identification tools. For the part on identification, we insisted on advices for interviewing a victim and identifying special needs. We also provide a list of questions that can be asked to victims to better identify their special needs. For the part on support and referral, we insisted on advices to support victims within the organization, but also we listed a wide range of specialized facilities, specialized NGOs, and we also insisted on the need to prevent re-trafficking. So we widely disseminated this tool in France to various kinds of actors, so national authorities specialized in refugees integration, accommodation center for refugees, social workers specialized in refugees integration, health services, social services. And we had a very positive feedback on the toolbox, and many practitioners, after reading the toolbox, asked for trainings to go deeper into the issue of trafficked beneficiaries. So I will now briefly present the trainings that we organized. So the objectives of the trainings were on both levels. First, to train actors involved in refugee integration on the issue of trafficking and the link with international protection. So to give them knowledge about the legal definition, figures, etc., but also to improve their capacity of identification of victims of special needs and to refer to specialized organization. And secondly, the objective of the meeting was to strengthen the relation between local actors on the territory, because victims are better supported when there is a strong local network with various organizations who collaborate according to their capacities. So the idea was to help them to meet each other so they can collaborate in an efficient way and accompany the victims at best. So therefore, we organized a multi-stakeholder actors. So participants came from different organizations, and also they had very different jobs. And we organized the victim in 3 different regions and in cities of different size, so in urban and rural areas. And we had a very, very positive outcome. So the practitioner underlined that they have appreciated the mix of theoretical and practical exercises within the training. And also they highlighted the interest of multi-stakeholders trainings, and that they explain that this multi-actor training will help them to create a local network of actors collaborating on this issue more efficiently. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. We'll continue with the presentation from Catherine on Ireland. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Cécile. First of all, I just want to note at the beginning and say a couple of words of thanks both to Cécile as the overall project coordinator, but more particularly our colleagues in France and across the EU. It's been a pleasure to work with them on the project. We were especially pleased to be involved, having worked with Hronková before in the previous TRACS project, out of which this TRIPS project grew, and it has provided a really good opportunity for us to consolidate the work in this area and to work more closely with our colleagues, as I say, across the EU. But more especially, it provided us with the opportunity to work at national level with other organizations working in this area or keen to work further in this area, including both state actors and civil society organizations. So it has really fostered opportunities for us to work more closely with relevant actors in this space. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, it provided us with an opportunity to work with survivors and to learn from them in this project about the specific needs that they have. And so we really value that. And I'd like to particularly thank those people who participated in that way and gave of their time and most especially their expertise and lived experience to facilitate us in developing the toolkit that actually reflects their needs. And I'd like to congratulate you, Cécile, on the development of the video that you launched this morning, because I think it really reflects as best we could those lived experiences, recognizing the difficulties that some people do continue to experience even several years after the fact of being identified and supported through processes to taking part directly and their faces being shown. So thank you very much for that. In terms of the Ireland toolbox itself and adapting it to the national context, very similar to the previous speakers from the Czech Republic and France, we adapted it specifically to incorporate elements from the Ireland report that was developed under the project to reflect our very specific national legal and policy context, but also to note the specific aspects of our national referral mechanism. Also, it was important to highlight the differences between the rights provided for persons who are granted international protection status and those who are granted a residence permission only under the administrative immigration arrangements for victims of trafficking in Ireland. And then also particularly relevant, I suppose, given the focus of the project is to support the integration needs of persons granted status who have been victims of trafficking, to provide a comprehensive list of supports that are available in Ireland for individuals and for organisations supporting victims of trafficking, to be able to refer them to appropriate supports, particularly in the context of employment, family reunification and psychosocial supports that may be needed. In terms of the trainings that we delivered at national level, we have to date delivered 3 focused trainings for what I describe here on the slide as different target audiences. So we felt that it was particularly important to target those professionals who we know already to be working with victims of trafficking in some capacity, whether that's as a lawyer or an NGO caseworker or what have you, but where their specific role may be quite niche or targeted, but because they are already working with them, it's very helpful for them to be able to refer where the matter that might need to be addressed or that arises in consultation is not something that they can personally deal with, but would like to refer for more specialist or appropriate supports. Additionally, we felt it was very important to target those state employees who have actual responsibility for identification of victims for the processing of international protection claims, particularly at the very outset of the process. So including border management officers, for example, immigration officers, on Garda Síochána, that's our national police force, and most especially the vulnerability assessment team for international protection applicants. And then finally, also to target frontline social care professionals engaging with migrant women quite broadly in different contexts, so particularly medical, nursing, social work, family resources, whatever that might be. But like our colleague from France, although we wished to target those different audiences, we actually very deliberately held multi-sectoral trainings. They weren't siloed, and we felt that that was important so as to foster kind of increased network buildings, so that people would actually not just be speaking to their own colleagues, but actually meeting some of the people that they may in time refer to or further develop links with, so as the ultimate objective of providing better supports to victims of trafficking with integration needs are met. As I say, we have provided 3 focused trainings to date. There were about 29-30 people in total who attended those trainings, which was again very positive. But the feedback and evaluation also was extremely positive. First and foremost, I suppose at a very general level, all of the participants, I think without exception, mentioned these particular adjectives, that the training was interesting, that it was relevant, and that it was very informative. But in particular, they welcomed the particular aspect of the training that focused on the practical, the working with the victim of trafficking, and in particular, how to conduct a sensitive interview so as to facilitate disclosure of relevant matters that they could then take forward to assist them. I've set out for you on the slide there some of the quotes provided, particularly from some of the participants. And while I won't actually read them all because they're there for you, I suppose just to note, as was already done by previous speakers, that what was really particularly relevant, I think, for us was the extent to which professionals who were already working with victims of trafficking identified that this particular training and the toolkit was extremely relevant for them, that it developed their understanding in a way that they hadn't previously. For example, if they were working with a particular context and have knowledge about the theoretical framework or the law, that this enhanced their understanding in terms of either working with that person or more particularly making appropriate referrals for additional needs to be met. So overall, some of them fed back that they would be highly recommending this training to colleagues that they work with already who felt that they would have certain knowledge, but that this would really facilitate greater understanding to support their work and more particularly the victims that they're dealing with. So thank you very much, Cécile.
Thank you, Catherine, for this presentation. And we finish last but not least with Italy and Daniela. Again, Daniela, you have the floor.
Thank you, Cécile. Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Cécile, for not only for today, of course, but also for the opportunity to work in this important project. And thanks to other colleagues, it was a really pleasure to work together. So just to summarize a bit the national context, as far as the Italian context is concerned, we consider it important to make reference in the first chapter, first of all, to of the toolbox, of course, to the Italian legal framework related to the National Anti-Trafficking Plan, and that is a plan issued by the Department of Equal Opportunities with the aim to provide guidelines to stakeholders involved in the process of identification, assistance, and protection of the victims of trafficking. It also includes, very important, the national referral mechanism. Moreover, it was important to include, in our opinion, the existence of other forms of protection besides the international protection. Particularly, we are referred to Article 18 and 20 of the immigration law, because Article 18 is important, considering that it specifically refers to the social protection of victims of trafficking, also regardless the formal report to the police and the access to protected programs. Whereas Article 22 is referred to the protection of the worker who can be exposed to labor exploitation by the employer. We consider it important to include these articles because they can offer additional safeguards to the victims, for example, the possibility to enter in safe housing. And the reference to this legislation is also important for users of the toolbox to identify the more adequate path for victims and to help them in finding the best support for victims themselves. In chapter 3, it was really important to include the national referral mechanism in terms of explanation of the functioning of the national referral mechanism for the identification, assistance, and protection of the victims. And it is provided basically referral procedure for the stakeholders, and also the national referral mechanism make reference to the national toll-free number run by Anti-Trafficking Network that can be used not only by stakeholders in contact with the potential victims, but also by victims themselves. So it is really, really important. Furthermore, at the end of the toolbox, we have inserted a list of anti-trafficking associations throughout Italy, and also useful links and telephone numbers with the aim to facilitate the referral and to improve the creation of a network and also the multidisciplinary approach. Next slide, thank you. In order to disseminate the national toolbox and to train the practitioners, we have organized 3 different trainings. The first one to social assistants throughout Italy. They coming from university, municipalities, advice centers, reception centers, so very different skills among social assistants, but we are very happy of these trainings. Even was online, unfortunately, but because we have reached a lot of many social assistants, but at national level, not only Rome or not only in the big cities, but throughout Italy, and we are very happy for this. The second training, the participants of the second training were legal and social operators coming from basically Italian reception centers and some regional offices, and the third training was in presence and involved a lot of second reception centers. In our opinion, was very important, considering that they have the possibility to make referral and often make assessment of vulnerabilities. Next slide, please. We think important to share with you some quotes from the trainings regarding the toolbox. The first one was regarding the fact that toolbox was useful because while trafficking is quite well known, fairly well known, victim special needs are little explored. So it was very important that a grid was provided in the toolbox. The second one found the toolbox very innovative and user-friendly, because you also can find trainings and that you have the possibility to have a concrete idea on how to behave in certain circumstances. And finally, a tool where there is everything we need to deal with persons with these vulnerabilities, and participants found very useful the grid at the end and the table with the services on the territory. So finally, just a minute, Cécile, to say a big thank to refugees who support us in better understanding their needs. We are honored of their participation in this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you all for your presentation, and as you all said, thank you to the refugees interviewed during the project, because it's really thanks to these interviews that we better understand their special needs, and the list of the needs that you can find in the European toolbox and in the national toolboxes are the needs identified during this interview. So we really tried to have a a tool which is really adapted to the trafficked refugees' special needs. So your presentation was very insightful. It's very interesting to see how you adapted this European toolbox to your national context, but also its added value, and to have this concrete feedback from participants to the trainings, and how we can improve the support provided to trafficked refugees. It's the topic of the next panel discussion. Coming back to Torsten to moderate again this final discussion, and I'll now give you the floor to exchange on this very specific topic from the field perspective, how we can improve the capacities, what is the added value of this toolbox, and what is the role of NGOs, authorities. I think we have a very rich panel to discuss this topic.
Yeah, indeed, we do have. Thank you very much, Cécile. And what you will see in our program is that we have, so far, we have in the last session reported about what the different partners in the consortium did. We will now be looking at what those they were in contact with did and what their perspectives are. We have an illustrious round of participants from civil society, state institutions, EU institutions, which have worked with the program. First of all, we'll have Markéta Hronková, and sorry, Markéta, I always get your pronunciation of the name wrong, who's director of La Strada in the Czech Republic. Léra Héricher, integration project officer of the Directorate of Foreigners in France, will follow. Then Nusha Hronková, with the National Independent Rapporteur, but known to many of us in her previous life, where she participated in activities. Maria da Pena Vilnario, who works at EASO and Senior Vulnerability Actions. And then last not least, Vincent Catot, who's a policy officer on migration policy with the DG Home in the European Commission. And we're very, very pleased that we have a second speaker from the DG Home in the European Commission, which is leading on the issue, has been so kind to provide funding for this project. But first of all, I get to Markéta, a long-standing expert in the question of human rights, in particular trafficking in human beings in its very, very different forms. And we come back to the question of main challenges to identify and support to trafficked person in the integration process. We have had a national toolbox by our colleagues of OPU. Has that helped, and what's the way forward? Markéta, it's great to see you again. It's great to see your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Hi, Torsten, and thank you for your kind words. I am very happy that I can see you all, or that I can hear you all. I'm very sorry that we did not meet in person, as I was ready to see the Christmas Brussels, but if it's as in Czech Republic, you probably will have also COVID Christmas. So it's great that we can share our experience with this project, at least like this. I was listening to all the presentations, and one more time I realized how important the existence of such projects is, not only from the point of view of international impact that it will have no European impact, but on the level of national impact it's having on the cooperation between the two parts of NGOs working with refugees, asylum seekers, or with trafficked persons, and with the authorities and frontline practitioners that are the ones who could be actually the identifiers of trafficked people. We worked pretty closely together, and I would like to thank OPU for this opportunity, because they did invite us from the very beginning to be part of this process. And I think that one of the best things that was happening besides the toolkit is actually the existence of the trainings that were very mixed and brought together social workers, lawyers, officers from different sides usually. And I think that this is where actually my small contribution will lead, and I hope that we will have then the discussion. It's that it's pretty clear how to proceed when you are dealing with trafficked people. It's pretty clear how to proceed when you are dealing with asylum seekers or beneficiaries of international protections. But it's getting very confusing and sometimes extremely hard to work with somebody who is first asylum seeker, second trafficked person, and third maybe becoming a beneficiary of international protection, but still stays a trafficked person. We tried during the trainings to do the one thing that we realized during all the project as the most important. It's to give the frontline practitioners a tool and capacity and ability probably also to hear and realize that there are some indicators of potential trafficking or exploitation in the story of the person that is sitting in front of them. I'm speaking from the point of view of civil society activist, long-term activist. So I will not deny that I see between the official administrators of the asylum seeking and protection integration process, I see a big difference between their way of dealing with asylum seekers and foreigners and beneficiaries of international protection and the social workers and lawyers of the CSOs. I'm afraid that in the process of asylum seeking and in the process of working with the migration status of the person, there is less of the will to look for the indicators of potential trafficking and of something that could actually support the claim of the persons to get the protection of the Czech Republic. And I think that this is where we are losing the most of trafficked people in the process. It's not after the granting of the international protection. It's actually in the first process, in the process of detention, in the process of first interviews, in the process of asylum seeking and the interviews for the asylum claim, where I think sometimes the indicators of trafficking are not heard or are actually even neglected because with the argument that it's nothing related to the asylum claim. I think that the trainings that we did were to some extent helpful in this, that it helped to sensitize a little and to show how small sentences, small stories, small parts of the interview or of the answers can show that there is a bigger problem behind. How the fact that somebody is trafficked and traumatized by the experience might have an impact on his or her way of seeing the linear story and being able to recount the story. How the fear of traffickers or fear of being re-trafficked can change the way how the person will present the life story, how it can be influenced. I think that all of you are aware with what Las Stradas in Europe are doing, but just to remind very quickly, we are, all of us in all the countries, we are usually pretty high thresh level organizations. It means that we are dealing directly with people who are exploited or trafficked. And one of the difficult specifics of trafficking is that very hardly somebody would self-identify. So we all rely extremely on the cooperation with frontline practitioners. And it's when talking about asylum seekers and beneficiaries of international protection, it's usually the organizations working with migrants, with asylum seekers, what we call the foreigners or migration organizations in Czech Republic. And we should be relying also on the interviewers of the Department of Asylum and Migration and on the social workers and workers of the administration of refugee facilities. If we, as La Strada, we do not have a direct access towards the detention centers and refugee facilities because we could hardly come there and ask who feels trafficked. It's usually while the asylum seekers or beneficiaries are speaking with the lawyers and social workers of other institutions or organizations that the indicators of trafficking pop up. So, and then it depends on our ability to train and to provide these people with information enough so that they know what to do in the moment they have these suspicions. So what we do is that we train all, we call them frontline practitioners, and I think that this is a term that appeared also within the presentations. And we are trying to do it in a very wide range, from the psychologists, healthcare providers, foreign police officers, judges, prosecutors, attorneys in law, and social workers and lawyers of other NGOs who are working in the field of migration and asylum seeking. So far, we are repeating this every 2 years, but and I think that it's also in the report that is coming with the TRIPS project. The problem is the high fluctuation of workers in the field, on the side of NGOs or on the side of state institutions, and also the fact that there is so many types of trainings and information that they are getting during their professional preparation for the job, or during their the obligatory formation during every year. There are so many information and so many topics that the trafficking is becoming one of many. And we notice this especially with, for example, police officers, that they meet, so that it happens to them so rarely that they actually are dealing with the problem of trafficking, that they have difficulties to somehow integrate the process, how to solve the situation, to integrate it in their mind setup. I use very often the comparison with what was happening with violence in intimate relationships in Czech Republic 15 years ago, when it was considered as a very private thing and no police officer actually knew what to do. And during the time, the conversation about the topic became so public that actually every police officer was having an automatic response towards the situation of intimate violence. The problem is that with trafficking, there is no way how they would live it so often through that it would become an automatic response. So what we are trying to do is to repeat the trainings, to do workshops that would be a little bit longer than what is usually within the preparatory formation of the officers, and to do it in such a way as Petra, for example, described the trainings that we did, means making tailor-made situation and role plays that can actually simulate an interview that would be led on a totally different topic, but that would contain indicators of the trafficking and what should be then done. All what we are asking, and I think that this is something that is very similar to also other countries, we are not asking the frontline practitioners to actually solve the situation and to deal with the trafficking situation and to be the ones who will guide the person through it. What we ask is to see the indicators and refer the person, or guide the person towards the services either of La Strada, or in case that the trafficking is still happening, towards police, and not to neglect that there might be this issue. Just for numbers, and I think I don't know if Petra was mentioning it, but the problem in Czech Republic is that we are having very low numbers of identified victims of trafficking in total, and very low number of identified asylum seekers being trafficked, and very low number of almost zero number of beneficiaries of international protection being identified. So it's very hard to create any trends and to make some general conclusions. But we are persuaded that within the asylum seeking procedure till the integration process, we are losing many people who were either trafficked at the very beginning of their journey, or trafficked on during the way, because along the migration routes we see a lot of trafficking, or being even trafficked in the Czech Republic after being part of the asylum procedure, or which is a case that we saw being re-trafficked or trafficked after they were granted the international protection. So there are many situations that we need to simulate and to talk about with the people who are in daily contact with the asylum seekers and with the beneficiaries of international protections. Usually we are training from 100 to 300 people a year. Not all of them are working with foreigners or asylum seekers or beneficiaries. And what we are also trying to do is some kind of prevention work to make higher awareness about trafficking as such, and especially about trafficking among migrants, so that there is a higher pressure on the general view and general understanding of the existence of the problem. And I would probably prefer to have questions asked, because there are so many things that I could go on, and I don't think that I have so much space here. And it's very weird to talk into the computer like this when I don't see anybody. So sorry if there was some incoherence.
Markéta, it was neither incoherent nor was it weird from our side, but I know what you mean. And we should do the exercise we've done the last round as well. If you immediately have any kind of remarks you would like to come back to, or questions you might want to ask, let me know and we come in with them. Otherwise, we will more have one presentation after the other, and then have a round of common points which were discussed. But I was very, very happy to hear that the project wasn't useless for you, but that there's something to build upon. Are there any questions? Type them into the chat, please. Well, it always needs some time to warm up to the discussion and ask questions. I'm then very, very happy that we have Héricher, who is the Integration Project Officer of the General Directorate of Foreigners in France. Markéta was giving us some input on how the NGO perspectives and cooperation has worked. But of course, the cooperation with state authorities played an important role, notably in France, indeed, the General Directorate of Foreigners in France. And Lea, the floor is yours, and you already have the PowerPoint presentation up on the screen. Please go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to the conference. Identifying and supporting vulnerable refugees is one of the main concerns for the French authorities for a few years. So my name is Héricher, and I work for the French Interior Ministry at the Asylum Direction. So we can go to the next slide, thank you. Today I will present you on 3 main points: how French authorities support the integration process of trafficked refugees, and how the national toolbox will support this work. So we can go to the next, thank you. So first, I would like to tell you more about this recent priority for the government. And I like to start with a few data. By the end of October this year, we had 84,000 asylum applications were registered, which is 24% more than last year, than 2020. For next year, 2022, we expect more applications, more like before the COVID crisis, where 133,000 asylum applications were registered in France. Top country of origin are Afghanistan, followed by Ivory Coast and Bangladesh. In terms of housing, we have almost 100,000 accommodation spaces for asylum seekers and around 9,000 for vulnerable refugees. Our work toward the integration of refugees victims of human trafficking is part of a larger project to better identify and provide support for vulnerable refugees. Indeed, during the 2015 migrant crisis, our government were dealing with the emergency and taking care of the first needs, so housing and quick response to asylum applications. But in 2018, the French authorities became aware of the need to build a stronger refugees integration policy. Therefore, an interministerial delegate to the reception and integration was nominated, and a strategy around this topic, around the integration, was drafted by the Direction of Asylum. During these years, we also noticed that there were more vulnerable refugees. Indeed, some of them were also victims of human trafficking, and we identify a lack of special support for them. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, thank you. So in May 2021, the Asylum Direction published its action plan in order to better identify and provide a better support for vulnerable asylum seekers and refugees. We draft this plan with the support of other governmental agencies, such as the Ministry of Health, French Office for Protection of Refugees and Stateless Persons, of course, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and NGOs such as Forum réfugiés-Cosi, but also we work with specialized NGOs in human trafficking, which are different from NGOs that work in the asylum field. This plan aims to reinforce the identification and support of vulnerable asylum seekers and refugees, whom can be identified in 5 groups: people with disabilities who are suffering of a serious illness or PTSD, women victims of violence, most vulnerable people among the LGBT+ community, unaccompanied minors, and trafficked people. So in the next slide, in my second part, I will tell you more about this action plan, and I will present you a few of them. Most of the actions are cross-functioning and will improve identification and support of trafficked people. I would like to first tell you more about the medical appointment. So starting last June in 3 regions, we offer to asylum seekers when they get registered, so at the very beginning of the asylum process, but also when they get the status, the possibility to have a complete checkup with doctors, like dental examination, lungs X-ray, or psychiatric questionnaire. So this medical appointment helps to identify proactively vulnerabilities linked to health conditions. We plan to expand this medical appointment in 3 other regions next year. One other action is to have vulnerability leaders in each region in order to have one single point of contact that gathers the needs of the most vulnerable asylum seekers and tackle all issues related to vulnerability through the regional network. Another action is the conception of training on vulnerability among all professionals in asylum integration field, like social workers who work in reception centers, registration agents. A 3 days training will be implemented in 1 region next January, and we'll have a special session dedicated to identification and response to special needs of trafficked people. Asylum Direction will include among trainers from NGOs specialized in the fight against human trafficking, and will present the national toolbox to participants. We expect to develop this training in all regions next year. But one of the main concrete action is to have dedicated housing for women victims of violence and human trafficking among the national housing plan. And this will be developed in my third part of my presentation. So as you can see, since 2018, 300 spots dedicated to women victims of violence or victims of trafficking have been created in accommodation centers for asylum seekers and refugees. Among these 300 spots, 66 are dedicated to vulnerable refugees. One can be offered a place in these particular centers at any time of the asylum process, even after they are recognized as refugees. So can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. The daily cost per housing has been increased by 13 euros to reinforce the services provided. For instance, single-sex housing, social and legal support, guaranteed safety condition of the buildings, for instance, ban of external visitors or on-call number outside the opening hours of the center, access to healthcare by, for instance, to have an in-house therapist or discussion group for women led by therapists, accompanying and supporting parents and schooling, and we ask to be part partnerships with local and national associations and institutions. So we can go to the next slide, thank you. 3 years after the beginning of this project, we can see very positive impact. All of the spots are in use. Also a strong local partnership between the different stakeholders. And finally, the implementation of interesting projects with the medical field. But we also see some challenges ahead. This program is not enough widespread and known among the stakeholders. We see also numerous and diverse situations to tackle, and we still face high needs in medical and mental health support. We can go to the next slide. As a conclusion, I would like to say that it is for sure that we need to make more effort to address especially the trafficked international refugees, and we did start concrete action to reinforce the policy. Information for victims, sensitivity trainings, adapted support, long-term care, and cooperation between stakeholders. This policy is challenging, and the success of it is linked to coordination of all stakeholders. And for sure, the National Toolbox will support this work of coordination. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for coming in from the different perspective of a state authority and its challenges, but also how cooperation and particularly the toolbox can help. I'm sure we will have lots of things to come back to. And unless you protest, I'm sure we can share all the presentations with everybody so that everybody has all the information to read at home. It gives me a great pleasure now to invite a colleague from the Irish side who previously was involved in activities and now represents the National Independent Rapporteur in Ireland under the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. Nusha, it's good to have you here. Tell us about what your findings and observations. We see your presentation, but I don't see you yet.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes. Hi there.
Okay, great. I was just saying that likewise, I'm also delighted to be invited here today and to see familiar faces of colleagues and partners I really enjoyed working with. I would like to congratulate you all, Forum Refugees and all the partners for proposing and implementing such a topical project. Most of all, I would like to commend you all for your consistency in exploring the interplay between international protection and human trafficking. I had the privilege, as Torsten said, to participate in the predecessor project TRACS, searching to systematize ways to identify special needs among asylum-seeking victims. The present project is in a way a logical continuation of this exploration. It is a work simultaneously original and of high relevance. And before I share some comments on the importance of the project and its outcomes for Ireland, I will briefly present my current perspective as a member of the National Rapporteur on Human Trafficking in Ireland. The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission is an independent public body appointed by the President and directly accountable to the Parliament. The Commission has a statutory remit set out under the Human Rights and Equality Commission Act of 2014 to protect and promote human rights and equality in Ireland and build a culture of respect for human rights, equality and intercultural understanding in the state. The Commission is Ireland's national human rights institution and is recognized as such by the United Nations. And it's also Ireland's national equality body for the purposes of a range of EU anti-discrimination measures. The Commission has been designated as Ireland's independent national rapporteur on trafficking in human beings in October last year and functioning as such since April of this year. So we are fairly new in the field. To bring this change into effect, a statutory instrument had been signed by the Minister for Justice, confirming the Commission in this new additional role. Article 19 of the EU Anti-trafficking Directive introduces a legally binding requirement for all EU member states to establish national rapporteurs or equivalent mechanism, and we are joining the list of countries that have independent such bodies. And as independent rapporteur, the Commission will prepare and publish monitoring reports and thematic reports evaluating Ireland's overall performance against states' international obligations. We recently completed our first report to the Council of Europe, third evaluation report, and as part of it, we raised the importance of intersection between international protection and human trafficking. It remains the case that Ireland does not permit a person to be formally identified as a victim of trafficking while they seek international protection. This leads to the differential treatment of victims of trafficking within the international protection system, and those formally recognized as victims by Garda Síochána, including with respect to residency entitlements and access to the labor market. There has been some reform with respect to access to the labor market for asylum seekers as of January 2021. Applicants for international protection can now apply for permission to access the labor market 6 months from the date of their first application for asylum, and permissions are subject to renewal every 12 months, which is very positive. These measures would benefit some victims of trafficking, but the divergence of rights based on whether or not a victim of trafficking seeks asylum in the state remains in place. Most recently, the OSCE urged a critical review of our main policy document outlining assistance to victims to ensure that victim status and entitlements are not linked to immigration status, while victims who wish to claim international protection are free to do so. We further note that in our jurisdiction, effective systems have been put in place to facilitate the identification of international protection applicants as victims of trafficking. In Italy, for example, guidance jointly developed by the UNHCR are now in formal use in both the international protection claim system and in the Italian national referral mechanism to ensure victims of trafficking and potential asylum applicants are identified. Since the formal adoption of these guidelines, over 10,000 asylum seekers in Italy have been identified as traffic victims, meaning that the Italian international protection system complements the national referral body, which is an ideal scenario. Various measures to form the international protection and reception system were outlined in February 2021 in the government white paper on ending direct provision, the system for accommodation of asylum seekers and victims of trafficking. The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission notes that measures on vulnerability assessment outlined in the white paper have the potential to assist in identifying victims of trafficking who find themselves in this system. And the Commission understands that there is currently a pilot of vulnerability assessment scheme in operation. The pilot will continue until the end of 2021. And soon we are expecting it to be evaluated, and this will be used to inform long-term implementation of vulnerability assessments in the future. The purpose of these assessments is to determine if, by virtue of a particular category of vulnerability, the applicant is deemed to have special reception needs and what these needs are. As of April, we have data for April 2021. 306 applicants have been entered the vulnerability assessment process, with 165 assessments complete and 129 ongoing. And so far, 97 applicants have been identified as having some sort of vulnerability, including human trafficking. A separate piece of information we received that on average in Ireland, around 10 people in the asylum process are identified and referred as victims of trafficking. And this is also almost true for this current year, but the data, we are still expecting the data for this. We can see that already the work of the project tracks and the current project trips will be relevant to the discoveries that will be made in Ireland in that regard. The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission recommends that the proposed new national referral mechanism expected in Ireland next year in March incorporates explicit provision to ensure the international protection can be pursued at any moment in time, whether prior to, during, or after identification as victims of trafficking, that formally identified victims have access to the rights and assistance measures put in place specifically for victims of trafficking, regardless of any pending international protection claims. By extension of this logic, the same is valid for already recognized recipients of international protection who should face no barriers in accessing special measures. The ultimate purpose of the anti-trafficking measures overall directed at victims of trafficking is the recovery, reintegration, and achievement of personal independence. In this context, I see the toolbox produced by the TRIPS project and adopted by the Immigrant Council of Ireland and other partners across Europe as a systematized, distilled knowledge and guidance that could assist integration into international protection workers encountering trafficked beneficiaries of international protection in their work. It would be useful for those who are in charge of designing and managing integration policies among state and civil society organizations. The toolkit could assist frontline workers requiring guidance to identify trafficking signs and to make referrals to appropriate services. It can equally be used by other professionals working in the field of integration. In Ireland, public bodies that could potentially benefit from the use of these toolkits are bodies such as the Irish Naturalization and Immigration Service, Border Management Unit, International Protection Office, International Protection Appeals Tribunal, the law enforcement and the specialized units within it, legal practitioners assisting asylum seekers and victims of trafficking, non-governmental organizations assisting asylum seekers and assisting victims of trafficking, the Civil Legal Aid Board, Health Service Executive Anti-Trafficking Team, the International Protection Accommodation Service, and others. Indeed, I could be listing also others. The dissemination will play a great role in the use of this helpful tool, as the previous speakers observed, and I'm aware that a national dissemination event is forthcoming in Ireland. Wishing you all best of luck with spreading the learning from this project, from the TRIPS project, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Nusha. Good to have you back, albeit in a different capacity. And I once again would like to underline the extreme importance of independent monitoring and reporting and rapporteur mechanisms for indeed assuring the protection of the human rights and the equality of those who have been affected by trafficking. Thank you very, very much indeed. We now move to another actor, which is in its development, namely the organization currently still known as the European Asylum Support Office, with the slogan "Support is our mission," and soon to be the European Union's Asylum Agency. And we have Maria da Pena Villarino, sorry for me struggling with the name, but I'm very happy there because you're doing a lot of work in equipping member states official in dealing with the complicated question of trafficked persons who are applying or granted international protection. Maria, once again, my apologies for getting your name slightly wrong, but I'm even more looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Torsten. Thank you, Cécile, all for inviting us to participate in this meeting, to hear your findings, to hear the insight of all the colleagues, which I will bring back to the team to analyze thoroughly. Yeah, I don't need an introduction. Torsten has already introduced me to you. I have also seen some familiar faces. Congratulations, Nusha, for your new position. And I would like to first start my intervention by framing our role on integration or the content of international protection, which it seems it is very much the line of this intervention. So first of all, I would like to say that we don't work directly on integration. We rather call and focus on pre-integration, since integration is not a part of our mandate. So as you know, the focus of our work is the asylum procedure, is the reception, and also this preparation for integration. So in order to ensure the autonomy and the conditions of the person when they are granted international protection. As well, in this line, we also have started to analyze what are the elements that the content of international protection is being granted for the refugees. So in this line, we have started to include this section on content of international protection in our asylum annual report, but it is quite brief and it doesn't zoom into the content provided to victims of trafficking. So unfortunately, I cannot give you this information. What I can say is the activities that we are doing in order to prepare the transition from the asylum procedure to this international protection status. As such, on the asylum procedure, we analyzed in 2019 the nexuses between the THP phenomenon and the international protection. Since, as other colleagues have or other panelists have mentioned before, it is always confusing the actors because they are being separated into two channels. Either you are a victim of trafficking, either you are an international protection applicant, which is not often the case. There are linkages and they have to be ensured and taken into consideration. And also THP can be a ground for international protection. So that has been already pointed out by our colleagues from UNHCR. On that complementary side, we also work on the reception conditions being set for persons with international protection needs. So in this part of our work, I can say that we had a thematic meeting on pre-integration with another network, which was EPRA, back in a while, where we saw that some of the points that were raised in the video you shared were very clear that there were some challenges there into ensuring that language courses, vocational trainings, activities to facilitate the access towards employment were some of the barriers that persons with international protection needs or already refugees were facing. It has to be said that most of the special conditions that are foreseen during the asylum procedure for victims of trafficking, meaning in the reception phase, should continue and being enhanced once they get refugee status. In this regard, you can see that in the qualification directive are equaling or putting at the same level international refugees and nationals of the country, meaning that they should be having equal conditions when accessing to education, when to healthcare, to accommodation, and even there are some particular specificities, some additional protection that the qualification directive mentions. And on this, I would like to mention to refer to Article 20 20.3 and 20.4 of the Qualification Directive, which states that when implementing the Charter on International Protection, on in the content of international protection, the specific situation of persons with special needs should be taken into account. It relates all the categories of vulnerable persons, including, of course, victims of trafficking in human beings. So when defining the content of international protection, these vulnerability, these special needs should be taken into account. And following the line that has been already paved by most of the colleagues here, there is a need of a vulnerability assessment, and that's how the Qualification Directive states it very, very clear, saying that these special needs need to be considered through an individual evaluation. So there is already there the legal obligation for this vulnerability assessment. And this is not something new, since we are speaking about in the whole asylum procedure and in the reception phase, we need to assess the needs of these special, the special needs of these persons. So it continues this line of an individual evaluation of seeing the impact of their vulnerability in the conditions that we are going to establish by law and also in the policies. As an example of that, you can see in the Article 30 mentions adequate healthcare, including mental health care for persons with special needs. So we are going into a specialized treatment that needs to be accessible to these persons. And we know the relevance of this particular service for victims of trafficking. And of course, Article 34, without going too much into provisions, but just to mention that specific needs of beneficiaries should be established and accessible in integration programs. So I just wanted to put a bit of a light on that, of a focus on those provisions, which really need to be there in our legislation and in our policies and the developments of SOPs and so on. What an additional element that is a bit of it might imply a bit of a challenge for EASO to come into this side is not only the mandate, but the more limited mandate, but also the counterparts. Our counterparts are usually reception authorities and asylum authorities. And we know that integration services are usually at the level of the regional authorities and also of the municipalities. So sometimes we don't find directly these counterparts to talk about, to discuss further about this issue. How can we frame our support? We certainly can share and disseminate our tools when they are relevant for this kind of authorities and also service providers. And let me give you a bit of more information on that. EASO's is particularly the vulnerability team I'm part of, focuses very much on ensuring the identification of vulnerable persons, including, of course, victims of trafficking. And for that, we have developed the IPSN tool, or the identification of persons with special needs, which you can see the indicators of victims of trafficking, information and connection to countries of origin or transit where these trafficking networks are active. And you can see that the level of support reaches until the end of the first instance decision. So in preparation, also this transition into integration. Also on the assessment of vulnerability and the assessment of the special needs of victims of trafficking, how they impact in the reception phase and in the asylum procedure. And I want to remind also that very many of the services that are being included in the reception phase as reception continue will continue. Sorry, as the reception conditions will continue beyond the asylum procedure, meaning, for example, access to a psychologist, access to language and translation services, or healthcare, as we are mentioning. And for this, we are developing the vulnerability and special needs assessment tool, which can be used for practitioners, for specialist practitioners. We are thinking all the time on this reception users. So you can see also that there could be some flexibility to be used by other professionals beyond the asylum procedure as well. And thirdly, we will also focus on referrals and on facilitating the referrals of victims of trafficking to adequate services. And in this line, we are developing as well the referral toolkit, which you will see once it's out, because we are currently building it electronically. You will be able to see the referral form in order to facilitate the connection between the referring authority and the service provider. And also you will see a functionality that you might find interesting, which is the mapping tool. And the mapping tool will help the referring authority to refer, for example, the victim of trafficking to specialized service providers. We, of course, will have to have some cautions in order to display or to not display the location of specialized services or protective shelters. So we are having already these considerations during the development of this tool. And I'm happy to, in this note, I finalize my intervention. I'm happy to take any questions you might consider, and very eager to see comments and suggestions. Thank you, Torsten. The screen is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Maria. And that was a very, very full presentation. We have a bit of a problem that we are running a bit late, and I'm just trying to find out whether we can extend a few minutes or whether at 13 hours precisely the connection will completely collapse. But for the time being, I would like to introduce our last panelist on here, who is Vincent Catot from the European Commission, who is being asked to tell us a bit more about EU actions to support integration policies at national level, where a lot of it is going on, and how EU action can capacitate practitioners and how the toolbox fits in there. Vincent, are you somewhere out there? If you are, make yourself known, please. You are there, so I mute myself and hand over to you.
Hi, good almost afternoon, would say. Thank you very much for inviting me for the fruitful discussions. I have the pleasures, but the difficulties to be one of the last speakers, where everybody thinks about lunch, and also being among the last. It's difficult after very interesting interventions. So I will try to be short in terms of time, and also not to repeat too much the very relevant points that previous speakers have mentioned. I will focus the role of the Commission, my intervention on the role of the Commission of DG Migration and Home Affairs, the role that we can play in practice regarding the integration of victims of trafficking, making a link with the TRIPS project. I work in the integration team of DG Migration and Home Affairs, and I cooperate regularly with Lucie Laffont that made a presentation earlier this morning. So very broadly, I would say that one can identify three key roles of the Commission regarding integration of migrants, which of course includes migrants victims of trafficking. First, we're a policy setting organization. Second, we're a bridge between stakeholders. And third, we're funding actors. In terms of policy setting, let me just remind you that our action is now framed by the action plan on integration and inclusion, which was adopted last year. This is roughly the first anniversary of this action plan. Only a first year among 7. So we have a few actions that were completed, but we're at the beginning of this great adventure of this action plan, which provide a comprehensive framework for the different aspect of integration policy. And that's, of course, one of the key tools we have in terms of policy setting. Let me just, I'm not going to go through the whole action plan, be reassured. I just wanted to underline one thing that I think is very relevant for, also based on the discussion we had this morning, is the mainstreaming aspect that we underline in our action plan. When we say mainstreaming, we mean mainstreaming integration in other fields. It was mentioned by other speakers this morning, is that you have different actors that are in contact with victims of trafficking. Some are specialized in working with victims of trafficking. Some are specialized in working with migrants. Some are not specialized in working with migrants, but they are providing essential services to people, including migrants and including victims of trafficking. And when we talk about mainstreaming integration, the idea is to put integration of migrants in these other fields. So in education, in housing, in labor, in access to the labor market. And here the idea is to, when it's possible, to adapt the existing services rather than creating parallel system parallel system, one for migrants and one for non-migrants. Adapting these services, adapting to the needs of migrants and adapting them to the needs, to the specific needs of for example, victims of trafficking, just like we would need, for example, to adapt the services to people with specific need, like unaccompanied children or people suffering from trauma or mental health issues. I think I noticed with interest that the toolbox, for example, offers the possibility for frontline workers to reflect about what they really need to know and to do a bit their own mapping in terms of training needs. I think that's very good to that's a good idea to implement, so that the frontline actors can really adapt and focus their attention on some of the aspects they might not be aware regarding the specific situation of victims of trafficking. What I've seen also from this project is that reflects quite well what we, of course, the usual priorities in terms of integration, which are valid for all migrants: education, employment, health, and housing. These are key pillars. They're equally important, and I think it's good to support the reflection that we need to work on all those aspects, because of course. You cannot have a proper access to labor market if you don't have adapted housing or access to the healthcare you need to be fully contributing to society. So all this, that's also a key aspect of the action plan, is to make those pillars really as important between one another. Then one aspect that we also underline in the action plan on integration, which was mentioned this morning, is integration as early as possible. So that's a key message that we provide to national authorities, which are key, some of the our regular stakeholders, as early as possible. There's no time to waste when we talk about starting integration process, but that doesn't mean, that it was mentioned this morning, that you need to do everything from the beginning. sometimes time is needed to feel strong enough, for example, to go back to work. Individual's approach is particularly relevant for victims of trafficking, and that's also the complementary principle of with the idea of integration as early as possible. This is individual's approach as early as possible. Then I would like also to underline that this individual's approach means that of course the different stakeholders need to be aware of the specific needs of victims of trafficking, but also aware of the possible diversity of profiles among victims of trafficking. Linguistically, but also in terms of needs. Not all victims of trafficking have the same needs in terms of access to mental health, for example, or in terms of languages, or in terms of employment-related training. So it's also good to remember of this this very individualist approach. Then very quickly, I think I'd like to mention to you, I just mentioned mental health, and there we have recently within the Urban Agenda Inclusion Partnership worked on an expert roundtable on access to mental health. And there we will also provide the key recommendation following this this meeting, and there was the many obstacles that some of you also mentioned today in terms of access to mental health, the practical and administrative aspect, the linguistic and the cultural. So to have this access to mental health, which is an essential service for everybody in our societies, adapted to the needs of victims of trafficking, is very essential, so that they can have this effective access and effective provision as early as possible, so they can also keep on with their integration process and their contribution to societies. Very briefly, I will move to the second point, which is the Commission as a bridge. And that's another key concept of the action plan, the multi-stakeholder approach. There, the Commission and DG Migration and Home Affairs is very much in contact with member states and national authorities. But what we underline in the action plan, and reflecting also in our funding instrument, is that integration policy can only be effective if you have a multi-stakeholder approach. The national actors are key actors, but they cannot be effective if they don't get the support, if they don't coordinate with other stakeholders at all stages and from all levels. So we put a lot of emphasis on local authorities in our action plan, but we also have a specific place for NGOs, including migrant-led organizations, and that's also, I think, something that all stakeholders need to reflect better on, how we can really provide a place for migrant-led organization at an early stage throughout the discussion and throughout the implementation. And I think in the example of training that we're providing today, I was very glad to see that this multi-stakeholder approach, building local networks, was at the center. And that's, I think, it's a key success factor, is this change of mindset from national authorities to work. Of course, they have their priorities in terms of integration policies, and that's part of the top-down approach, but it's clear that they need to have this bottom-up approach. More and more member states are implementing it. This is part of the partnership principle that we have with the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, where they need to consult the relevant stakeholders. And building this approach, I think, is now understood widely as effective, but we still need to really support this partnership in terms of funding, of course, but in terms of really real cooperation from the start and throughout the implementation. Of course, it takes time, but it's a worthwhile investment. And I think the toolbox that was mentioned in this project, it's good that you have the possibility to adapt it to the national context, given the diversity of administrative and political structures that we have in the EU. I will end here, given the time, on the last aspect of funding actors. Lucie mentioned this morning the call for proposal that we will have in 2022 as part of the Asylum Migration and Integration Fund for transnational project on issues related to victims of trafficking. What we do as well is we work very closely with national authorities, because they are in charge of the national program of the same fund, the Asylum Migration Integration Fund, AMIF, because here, and that's where most of the money goes. So I also encourage you stakeholders to really get in touch with the national authority in charge of the AMIF, to influence the priorities and to be part of their implementation. So we insist on some of the priorities in line with the action plan. We also take, and that's also why we have a transnational project. We take those good practices and we try to convince member states to implement them at national level with AMIF national program support, to really create this sustainability of projects and contribution from civil society. What we do as well is we have the other main network, which is the European Integration Network, which are contact points from the ministry in charge of integration issues. It could be Ministry of Employment or Ministry of Interior, which is, for example, the case for in France. There, what we have is really more policy content contact points, and we try to create this link with the funding to reflect on the good practices and how they can include that in their national action plan, national programs, in terms of policy and in terms of content. I would like to mention one last point in terms of bridging and funding. There are other funding tools, for example, the European Social Fund Plus, which are very relevant for migrants, including victims of trafficking. For example, when you talk about training for employment access and labor market access. So it's also important to go outside our only migration box sometimes to get other supports. I thank you very much, and as a final point, I would like to encourage you to share your ideas and practices and events on the European website on integration, which is our tool to share information between stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincent, and thanks for reminding us of the website on integration, which is extremely useful on integration in general, not just in this specific context. Yeah, we have the dilemma which we usually have. We've run out of time. I understand we still have some time for conclusions. I had asked if somebody has an absolutely burning question which they would like to ask now. That is not the case. So either there is no question or people are more interested in lunch. We take it as it is, and I'd like to thank all our panelists for their important contributions. And I think we might be coming back to some of them in a later context. And indeed, we will share the points from the interventions and the contributions. But this gives me now the possibility to close this round and hand over to the colleagues from Forum réfugiés-Cosi. I don't know whether Cécile herself is first in or it's directly Laurent, but I would just like to thank you for your attention and the interesting discussion and contributions from my side.
Thank you, Torsten. Thank you all to all the panelists for this very interesting presentation, and it really opens a very interesting perspective for after the project. Again, we are closing one project, but it's only the first step to improve our support to trafficked refugees with these new tools, with the recommendation in the European report. I'm putting again the link to access our deliverables on this project, the European toolbox and the report. Do not hesitate to go through these two documents, and for European member states, national authorities, or social workers and NGOs. to adapt this European toolbox to your national context and improve the capacities of all stakeholders with this multidisciplinary approach, multi-stakeholder approach that we discussed today. So thank you to all the panelists. I'm turning now to Laurent for a short concluding word, and I would like to thank you again all for your participation today, and also to the TRIPS partners. It was a great pleasure to collaborate with you along these two years, and I hope that we will have other opportunities to collaborate. So I'm turning now to Laurent.
Thank you, Cécile. Short conclusion, but 2 or 3 minutes because we don't have time now. But during all this conference, we have seen many significant challenges to better address special needs of refugees victims of trafficking. Amongst them, we can quote data collection, identification, coordination between different stakeholders, access to adapted services, and more generally, correct application of the existing legal framework. The link between the asylum procedure and the integration process for these victims is a cross-cutting issue that should be especially addressed. During presentation on national toolboxes and trainings, we've seen the enormous work that has been carried out by all the partners and the added value of this project, which combines research work and field actions. But I will not summarize all the content of this conference now. It would be too long and we don't have time. But I just remind you that you can refer to reports and tools published online. The video of this conference will also be available on our website and in YouTube. So we encourage you to share all these results with your contacts. And don't hesitate to contact us for more information on this project or related issues. So the project is finished, but the problem unfortunately still exists. And as Torsten said, the work continues, and this project is the beginning of something. Some elements of this conference may bring some hope for the situation to improve. Very specific recommendations are now on the table. High-level speakers have shown a strong interest for this issue today, and practical tools are now available to improve situation and improve support for these victims. As a conclusion of the conclusion, I'd like to thank again all people involved in this project, with a special mention to my colleague Cécile for the coordination of all these activities. I would like to thank one last time the participants of this conference who took a part of their precious time to be here. We hope that this project and this conference will help improve the situation for these refugees, victims who deserve full protection and adequate support in order to fully integrate their new countries, their new European countries. Thank you and have a good day, and we keep in touch in these issues. Thank you.